Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The smell of cutting oil and hot metal had been Ronan Merritt's morning cologne for 37 years. At 61, he could tell the quality of a bearing just by the sound it made spinning on its shaft. His hands, scarred from decades of precision work, moved across the blueprints with the confidence of a surgeon. Merritt. The voice cut through the factory noise like a blade through butter. Ronan looked up from the CNC machine he'd been calibrating. Todd Brennan, the new plant manager, stood 10 feet away with a manila folder clutched against his chest. Behind him lurked Janet from HR, her face pale as fresh concrete. "We need to talk." The words every factory worker dreaded. Ronan set down his calipers and followed them to the glass-walled office overlooking the production floor. Through the windows, he could see his crew working the machines he'd taught them to operate. Young faces mixed with gray beards, all focused on their tasks. Todd opened the folder without ceremony. "Effective immediately, your position is being eliminated." Ronan had expected this moment ever since Blackstone Capital bought McVeigh Precision Works 6 months ago. The suits had toured the facility with their clipboards and smartphones, asking questions about efficiency metrics and labor optimization. But expecting a punch to the gut doesn't make it hurt less. 37 years, Ronan said quietly. "We appreciate your service," Janet recited. "The package includes 2 weeks severance pay and continued health benefits for 60 days. 2 weeks. Ronan's voice carried no emotion. "For 37 years. Todd shifted in his chair. "Look, Ronan, you know how this works. The new owners need to streamline operations. Your role as senior machinist is redundant now that we're bringing in automated systems." Redundant. The word hit harder than being called old or useless. Redundant meant unnecessary. Disposable. "What about the apprentice program?" Ronan asked. "Training the next generation? That's being discontinued," Todd said. "The new machines pretty much run themselves." Ronan thought about Jake Morrison, 19 years old and eager to learn. The kid had real talent, steady hands, and the patience to get things right. Now he'd be out on the street too, another casualty of progress. "I see." Ronan stood up slowly, his knees protesting after decades of standing on concrete floors. "When do I clean out my toolbox?" "Security will escort you out today," Janet said, not meeting his eyes. "Your personal tools will be mailed to your home address." Personal tools. Ronan's father had given him his first set of precision instruments when he turned 18. Every wrench, every gauge, every measuring device had been earned through years of careful work and honest pay. Now they'd be boxed up by strangers and shipped like surplus inventory. 37 years, he repeated to Todd's jaw tightened. "This isn't personal, Ronan. It's business. Everything's personal when it's your life being decided by spreadsheets." The security guard appeared at the door, a young man who probably made more in a year than Ronan's severance package. They walked together through the factory floor in silence. Workers looked up from their stations, understanding immediately what was happening. Some nodded. Others looked away. At his workstation, Ronan picked up the small framed photo of his late wife, Helen. She'd been gone 3 years now, but her smile still gave him strength. The photo was the only personal item he took. Everything else belonged to the job that no longer wanted him. Outside in the parking lot, the November wind cut through his work jacket. 43 years old when he'd started here. 61 now. In between, he'd helped build this place into something that mattered. McVeigh Precision made components for medical devices, aircraft engines, and industrial equipment. Real things that kept the world running. Now robots would do his job. Faster, cheaper, and without the inconvenience of needing healthcare or retirement benefits. Ronan started his truck, a reliable Ford that had seen better decades. As he drove away from McVeigh Precision Works for the last time, he caught sight of the company sign in his rearview mirror. New logo, new colors, new owners. Nothing stayed the same except the work itself, and soon even that would be different. His phone buzzed with a text message. Probably Deshaun Briggs, his closest friend at the plant, asking how it went. Ronan didn't check. Not yet. First, He needed to figure out how to tell his son that his old man had been thrown on the scrap heap. The drive to Pittsburgh took 2 hours. 2 hours to rehearse what he'd say to Calder, his only child. 2 hours to swallow his pride and admit he needed help. Calder's neighborhood in Shadyside looked like something from a magazine. Perfect lawns, imported cars, houses that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Ronan's truck looked out of place among the Tesla sedans and BMW SUVs. He parked in front of a colonial-style house with black shutters and a red door. Calder had done well for himself in the tech world, building software that optimized supply chains for major corporations. Smart kid, always had been. Maybe too smart for his own good. Ronan walked up the brick pathway and rang the doorbell. Through the frosted glass, he could see movement inside. The door opened to reveal Mallory, Calder's wife. She was dressed in yoga clothes that probably cost more than Ronan's monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. Ronan. Her smile was polite but cold. This is unexpected. Is Calder home? He's in his office. Working. She emphasized the last word as if it were a foreign concept to Ronan. Is everything all right? Before Ronan could answer, Calder appeared behind her. At 34, he had his mother's sharp features and his father's stubborn jaw. His expensive shirt was wrinkled from hunching over computer screens, and his eyes held the distracted look of someone whose mind was always 3 problems ahead. Dad? What are you doing here? Need to talk to you. Calder glanced at his watch. I've got a client call in 20 minutes. This won't take long. They moved to the living room, a space decorated in whites and grays that felt more like a showroom than a home. Ronan sat on the edge of a couch that cost more than his truck, while Calder remained standing near the fireplace. I got laid off today, Ronan said without preamble. Calder's expression didn't change. I'm sorry to hear that. 37 years. New owners want to automate everything. That's how business works now, Dad. You have to adapt or get left behind. The casual dismissal stung worse than the actual firing. Ronan had expected sympathy, maybe even anger on his behalf. Instead, he got a lecture about adaptation. I need a place to stay, just for a few weeks while I figure out what's next. Mallory's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. She moved closer to Calder, a united front against the intrusion. Dad! Calder ran his hand through his hair. This isn't really a good time. Won't be a good time. We're in the middle of a funding round. I'm working 18-hour days. Mallory's starting her wellness consulting business. We just don't have the bandwidth to. I'm not asking for bandwidth. I'm asking for a couch and maybe some coffee in the morning. Mallory stepped forward. Ronan, we understand this is difficult, but you have to take responsibility for your situation. If you had planned better for retirement, if you had developed other skills, you wouldn't be in this position. The words hit like a slap. Ronan had spent his life building things, fixing things, teaching younger workers how to take pride in their craft. He'd paid his taxes, raised his son, cared for his dying wife without complaint. But according to his daughter-in-law, his only mistake was not being born rich enough to afford failure. Mallory's right, Calder said, and those 2 words cut deeper than anything else. I can't enable this kind of thinking. You need to stand on your own feet, like you did. The question came out sharper than Ronan intended. Calder's face flushed. What's that supposed to mean? Who paid for your college? Who co-signed your first apartment lease? Who gave you $5,000 to start your business? That's different. I was building something. I had a plan. And I don't. Do you? Calder crossed his arms. What's your plan, Dad? Come here and feel sorry for yourself while I pay your bills. Ronan stood up slowly. The room felt smaller now, the expensive furniture pressing in on him like the walls of a tomb. I'm not running a retirement home for bitter old men, Calder said, the words delivered with surgical precision. Mallory nodded in agreement. If you had planned better, you wouldn't be here. Ronan looked at his son for a long moment. The boy he taught to throw a curveball. The teenager he'd helped with calculus homework. The young man he'd been proud to watch succeed. Now a stranger in an expensive house who'd rather see his father homeless than admit weakness in front of his wife. You're right, Ronan said quietly. I shouldn't be here. He walked to the door without another word. Behind him, he heard Calder call his name, but he didn't turn around. The red door closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot. In his truck, Ronan sat for several minutes before starting the engine. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. 37 years of honest work. And this was what he had to show for it. A son who saw him as a failure and a daughter-in-law who measured his worth in dollars and cents. The drive back to his apartment in Erie was a blur of highway lights and bitter thoughts. He'd raised Calder to be independent, to think for himself, to never settle for less than he deserved. Maybe he'd done too good a job. Ronan's apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades. The rent was cheap because the neighborhood wasn't fashionable, and the neighbors were mostly retired factory workers like himself. People who understood that dignity wasn't measured by square footage. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and stared at the business card he'd been carrying in his wallet for 3 months. Morrison and Associates, Estate Planning. The lawyer who'd been trying to reach him about his Aunt Dorothy's will. Dorothy Brennan had been his mother's younger sister, a woman who'd never married and had channeled all her energy into building a small empire of rental properties across western Pennsylvania. She'd been tough as railroad steel and twice as stubborn, qualities that serve her well in a business dominated by men. Ronan had visited her maybe a dozen times in his life, usually at family funerals or holiday gatherings. She'd always seemed to approve of him, though she'd never said why. Maybe it was because he worked with his hands like she did, or because he didn't put on airs about his education or accomplishments. He'd avoided the lawyer's calls because he assumed there was some small bequest involved, maybe a few $1,000s or a piece of family jewelry. The last thing he'd wanted was to sit in some office and pretend to be grateful for table scraps while dealing with the complexities of probate court. But tonight, with his son's rejection still burning in his chest, he needed to know what Dorothy had left behind. Maybe it would be enough to cover a security deposit on a smaller apartment, or to buy some time while he figured out his next move. The lawyer's office was in downtown Erie, in one of the old buildings that had been renovated to attract professional tenants. Ronan arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room, surrounded by law books and diplomas that meant nothing to him. "Mr. Merritt?" A woman in her 50s emerged from an inner office. "I'm Patricia Morrison. Thank you for finally coming in." Her handshake was firm, and her eyes held the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk. She led him to her office and gestured to a chair across from her desk. "I've been trying to reach you for months," she said, opening a thick file folder. "Your aunt left very specific instructions about her estate. I figured there might be a few $100s or something." Patricia Morrison smiled. "Mr. Merritt, your aunt was worth considerably more than most people realized. She owned 37 rental properties, had substantial investments in blue-chip stocks, and maintained several savings accounts across different banks." Ronan felt a strange disconnection, as if she were talking about someone else's life. The total value of her estate, after taxes and expenses, is approximately $3.1 million. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Ronan stared at the lawyer, waiting for her to laugh or explain the mistake. $3.1 million, yes. And according to her will, you are the sole beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Ronan gripped the arms of his chair and tried to process what he'd just heard. Dorothy, who'd worn the same winter coat for 15 years and drove a pickup truck older than his own, had been a millionaire. "Why me?" Patricia consulted the file. She left a letter explaining her decision. "Would you like me to read it?" Ronan nodded, not trusting his voice. The lawyer lifted a handwritten page from the folder and cleared her throat. "Dear Ronan, if you're hearing this, it means I've finally worn out my welcome on this earth. I'm leaving you everything because you're the only person in our family who understands the value of honest work. You never asked me for anything, never sucked up to me because you thought I had money, never treated me like a charity case because I lived simply." She paused and looked up at Ronan. "Should I continue?" "Please. I made my fortune by buying properties when nobody wanted them and turning them into something worthwhile. I lived below my means because I wanted to see what kind of people surrounded me when they thought I had nothing to give. Most of our relatives stopped calling years ago. You were different. You treated me the same whether I was rich or poor, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character. Use this money wisely. Make it count. Love, Aunt Dorothy." Patricia set the letter aside and pulled out a thick stack of documents. She also left instructions that the inheritance should remain private. She didn't want anyone to know about it, unless you chose to tell them. Ronan thought about his conversation with Calder earlier that day. His son's dismissive attitude, Mallory's lecture about responsibility and planning. They'd looked at him and seen a failure, a man who'd reached the end of his usefulness. Nobody else knows about this, only myself and my assistant, who's bound by attorney-client privilege. Your aunt was very clear about maintaining discretion. Ronan accepted the keys to Dorothy's house and the paperwork that would transfer her assets to his name. Walking out of the lawyer's office, he felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. For the first time in his life, he had choices. Real choices. That evening, Ronan sat in Dorothy's old house, surrounded by furniture that had been fashionable in the 1980s and photographs of people he barely remembered. The house was paid off, along with all the rental properties. The investment accounts were diversified and growing. His aunt had built something real and lasting. Just like he'd tried to do at the factory, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to Calder's number. His thumb hovered over the call button for several minutes. He could explain about the inheritance, prove that he wasn't the broken-down failure his son thought he was. He could offer to help with Calder's business, maybe even become an investor. But he didn't call. Instead, he set the phone aside and made himself a simple dinner. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out what to do with this unexpected gift. Tonight, he just wanted to sit quietly and think about the woman who'd believed in him when his own family wouldn't. Dorothy had lived simply and died rich. She'd tested the people around her by pretending to be poor, and most of them had failed that test. Her letter had called it wisdom, and maybe she was right. Ronan thought about Calder's words, "I'm not running a retirement home for bitter old men." His son had seen a burden, not a father. A problem to be solved, not a person to be helped. Now Ronan knew something his son didn't. He wasn't poor. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't helpless, that he was angry. The Bluebird Diner in Braddock had been serving coffee and comfort food to steel workers for 60 years. The vinyl booths were cracked, the 4 mica tables were chipped, and the coffee could strip paint off a car bumper. It was exactly the kind of place where 3 people could have a conversation without being overheard or interrupted. Ronan slid into the corner booth where Deshaun Briggs was already waiting. His friend looked older than his 55 years, the stress of unemployment showing in the gray stubble on his cheeks and the tension around his eyes. "Heard about yesterday," Deshaun said without preamble. "Bastards. Your turn next week. Friday. They're keeping 12 people out of 47. Before Ronan could respond, Bertie LaCroix appeared at their table with a pot of coffee and an attitude that could cut steel. At 63, she owned the diner and had opinions about everything that happened in the Rust Belt. Her red hair was streaked with silver, and her hands were stained with years of hard work. "Look what the cat dragged in," she said, pouring coffee without being asked. "Heard you got the axe yesterday." News travels fast. Everything travels fast in a town this size. She set the pot down and studied Ronan's face. "You look different, though. Less beaten down than I expected." Deshaun raised an eyebrow. "You do seem pretty calm for someone who just lost his life's work." Ronan took a sip of coffee and considered how much to tell them. These were his people, workers who'd spent their lives building things and fixing things and keeping America running. They'd understand better than most what he was planning. "I inherited some money, enough to make some changes." "How much?" Bertie asked bluntly. "Enough." She laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Mysterious. I like that. What kind of changes?" Ronan pulled out a notebook and opened it to a page covered with his careful handwriting. "Deshaun, what do you know about Calder's business?" "Your boy. He does logistics software, right? Supply chain optimization. He's trying to raise money for expansion. Series B funding, he calls it." Bertie slid into the booth next to Deshaun. "You're not thinking of helping him out, are you? After what he said to you?" "Not exactly." Ronan turned the notebook so they could see his notes. "I'm thinking of helping his competition." The plan he'd been developing for the past week was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Using his inheritance, he would create a network of shell companies and holding firms to obscure his involvement. Then he would systematically undermine Calder's business by supporting his competitors, disrupting his supply chains, and making his life as difficult as possible. "That's cold," Deshawn said after Ronan finished explaining. "Effective but cold. He made his choice. Now I'm making mine." Bertie grinned. "I know that look. That's the same look you got when Tommy Kowalski was bullying Calder in 8th grade. This is different." "No, it's not. You're protecting your family's honor the only way you know how. By hitting back harder than they hit you." Ronan closed the notebook. "I need help. Deshawn, you know the engineering side of manufacturing. Bertie, you understand small business operations. I've got the money and the motivation, but I need people I can trust. What's in it for us?" Bertie asked. "Deshawn gets his job back, eventually. You get to watch rich kids learn that actions have consequences. And we all get to prove that experience beats algorithms." They spent the next 2 hours refining the plan. Deshawn would help identify Calder's key competitors and suppliers. Bertie would provide local business connections and serve as a front for some of their operations. Ronan would provide the funding and strategic direction. "There's one more thing," Ronan said as they prepare to leave. "I want to find talented people who've been overlooked. People like us who got pushed aside because they didn't fit the new economy." "I know just the person," Deshawn said. "Maribel Franco. Brilliant engineer, used to work at Westinghouse before they downsized. She's been trying to start a robotics consulting firm, but nobody will give her a chance." "Why not?" "She's Latina, 45 years old, and she doesn't have an MBA from Carnegie Mellon. In Pittsburgh tech circles, that makes her invisible." Ronan made a note in his book. "Not anymore." 2 months later, Ronan sat in a coffee shop across the street from Calder's office building, watching his son through the large windows. Calder was pacing back and forth in the conference room, gesturing animatedly to a group of men in expensive suits. The potential investors looked skeptical. They had good reason to be skeptical. Over the past 8 weeks, Ronan had quietly leaked performance data about Calder's company through carefully cultivated sources in the tech community. Nothing illegal, nothing that wasn't already public record if someone knew where to look. But presented in the right context, the numbers painted a picture of a company that was struggling to meet its growth projections. That Ronan's phone buzzed with a text from Bertie. "Package delivered." She just completed the purchase of Millstream Components, a small part supplier that provided critical hardware for Calder's software installations. The previous owners had been eager to sell to a mysterious buyer who'd offered 20% above market value. Within a month, Millstream would triple its prices for Calder's orders, forcing him to either eat the cost or pass it on to his customers. Either choice would damage his competitive position and make the investors even more nervous. At the same time, Maribel Franco was working out of a small office in Lawrenceville, building relationships with the same companies that Calder was courting. Her robotics consulting firm, funded through one of Ronan's shell companies, was offering similar services at lower prices with faster turnaround times. Ronan's approach was methodical and patient. He wasn't trying to destroy Calder overnight, but to slowly strangle his business through 1,000 small cuts. Death by inches, administered by people who understood how to build things and break them. His phone rang. Patricia Morrison, the estate lawyer. "Mr. Merritt, I wanted to update you on the holding company structure. Everything is in place, and your financial activities are completely insulated from your personal identity." "Good. Any problems with the bank transfers?" "None at all. Your aunt's portfolio is generating substantial returns, so your activities aren't even touching the principal. You could keep this up for years without affecting your long-term financial security." Years. Ronan liked the sound of that. This wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. He had the resources and the patience to play a long game, something his son had never learned to do. After ending the call, he walked to the building's lobby and took the elevator to the 15th floor. Calder's office suite was modern and sterile, all glass and chrome and motivational posters about disruption and innovation. The receptionist was young and perky, the kind of person who probably thought disruption was a positive word. "I'm sorry, Mr. Merritt is in a meeting with investors. Can I take a message?" "Tell him his father stopped by." "Oh, Mr. Merritt Sr. He's mentioned you. Should I interrupt the meeting?" "No need. Just wanted to wish him luck with the funding." Ronan left the building and drove to his next appointment. Willa Caro, The CEO who'd fired him from McVeigh Precision was about to discover that her quarterly profit projections were overly optimistic. 3 of her major customers had just signed contracts with competing firms, and her automated production line was experiencing mysterious quality control issues. She'd attributed the problems to market forces and technical difficulties. She had no idea that Ronan had systematically convinced her customers to switch suppliers and that Disowned was providing technical consultation to the union workers who were sabotaging her precious robots. Revenge was supposed to be a dish served cold, but Ronan was finding it quite satisfying at room temperature. De Calder's house looked different in the winter twilight. The perfect lawn was covered with snow, and the expensive cars in the driveway were coated with ice. Through the large windows, Ronan could see his son pacing around the living room while Mallory sat rigid on the white couch. They were fighting. Ronan parked down the street and watched from his truck. He'd come here to observe the effects of his campaign, but seeing his son's distress stirred unexpected emotions. For a moment, he considered walking up to the door and offering to help. Father to son, the way it should be. Then he remembered Calder's words, "I'm not running a retirement home for bitter old men." Through the window, he could see Mallory's father, Cliff Rylance, gesturing angrily while Calder stood with his head in his hands. Ronan knew Cliff from reputation, a steel magnate who'd sold his company to foreign investors and retired to a mansion in Sewickley. The kind of man who measured everyone by their net worth and found most people wanting that. Ronan's phone buzzed with a call from Disowned. "You watching the fireworks?" From across the street. "What did you find out?" Calder mortgaged the house to fund his latest development cycle. Mallory's father just found out, and he's cutting them off financially. Word is she's talking to divorce lawyers. The conversation continued for several minutes, but Ronan's attention was fixed on the scene playing out in his son's living room. Mallory was crying now, her perfect composure finally cracking under the pressure. Calder looked defeated, slumped in a chair that cost more than most people's cars. "Any regrets?" Disowned asked. Ronan watched Cliff Rylance storm out of the house, leaving his daughter and son-in-law to deal with the consequences of their choices. None. But that wasn't entirely true. He regretted that it had come to this. He regretted that his son had chosen pride over family. He regretted that Mallory had been raised to believe that money was more important than loyalty. Most of all, he regretted that Helen wasn't alive to see what their boy had become. The investigation into Calder's business troubles was yielding results. A forensic accountant hired by one of the potential investors had traced some of the market interference back to shell companies, but the trail went cold at multiple layers of legal protection. Calder suspected sabotage, but he couldn't prove it and couldn't identify the source. That was the beauty of Ronan's approach. Everything he'd done was technically legal. He was simply a savvy investor making strategic decisions in a free market economy. If those decisions happened to damage his son's business, well, that was just the invisible hand of capitalism at work. His phone rang again. This time, it was Maribel Franco. "We got the Westinghouse contract. Calder's biggest prospect, his only prospect. They loved our presentation, and our timeline is 6 months faster than his." Ronan felt a surge of satisfaction. Maribel was exactly what he'd hoped to find: brilliant, experienced, and hungry for a chance to prove herself. Under different circumstances, she and Calder might have been colleagues or even partners. Now she was his executioner. What about the patent application? Filed yesterday. If approved, it'll give us exclusive rights to the automation interface technology. His entire platform will be obsolete. Ronan had funded Maribel's research and development for months, giving her access to resources that Calder couldn't match. While his son was scrambling for investor meetings and trying to bootstrap his way to the next level, his competition was building something better with unlimited financial backing. Excellent work. How's the team building coming along? We're up to 12 engineers now, all people who were laid off or passed over by other firms. They're motivated. Motivated was an understatement. Ronan had assembled a team of displaced workers who understood exactly what it felt like to be discarded by the new economy. They weren't just building a business. They were proving a point about the value of experience and craftsmanship. After ending the call, Ronan drove home to Dorothy's old house. He'd been living there for months now, gradually making it his own. The investment portfolio was growing steadily, and his network of business interests was expanding across western Pennsylvania. But the best part wasn't the money or the power. It was the knowledge that he'd taken the worst day of his life and turned it into the foundation for something bigger. His son had taught him that family loyalty was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now Ronan was teaching him that disrespect had consequences that compounded over time. The lesson was almost complete. The McVeigh Precision Works boardroom hadn't changed much since Ronan's termination 8 months earlier. Same polished table, same view of the factory floor, same air of corporate arrogance. But today, the power dynamic was different. Willa Caro sat at the head of the table, surrounded by board members who were studying the quarterly reports with increasing alarm. Production was down 18%. Quality control issues had cost them 3 major contracts. The automated systems that were supposed to revolutionize their operations were plagued with problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Willa began, her voice steady despite the crisis enveloping her company. "I know these numbers look concerning, but I'm confident we can turn things around in the next quarter." "How?" The question came from Marcus Webb, a board member who represented Blackstone Capital's interests. "We've invested millions in automation, and it's not delivering the promised returns. The technology is sound. We're experiencing some integration challenges, but my team is working around the clock to resolve them." What Willa didn't know was that her integration challenges were being systematically created by Deshaun Briggs, who was providing technical consultation to the union workers she tried to replace. Every software glitch, every calibration error, every mysterious breakdown could be traced back to people who understood the machines better than the engineers who designed them. That a knock on the door interrupted the discussion. Willa's assistant entered with a concerned expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a gentleman here representing a group of shareholders. He says it's urgent." The gentleman turned out to be Lawrence Patterson, a corporate lawyer from Pittsburgh who specialized in hostile takeovers. He was accompanied by 2 associates carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested they weren't there to discuss quarterly earnings. "Ms. Caro," Patterson said without preamble, "I represent a coalition of shareholders who collectively own 28% of McVeigh Precision Works. We're here to call for a vote of no confidence in your leadership." Willa's face went pale. "On whose authority?" Patterson opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents. "Iron Valley Holdings, Keystone Industrial Partners, and Rust Belt Investment Group have pooled their shares to demand immediate management changes. The vote will take place in 30 days, as required by corporate bylaws." The names meant nothing to the board members, but Ronan recognized them immediately. They were 3 of the shell companies he'd created to obscure his growing influence in regional manufacturing. Over the past 6 months, he'd quietly purchased minority stakes in dozens of companies, always staying below the threshold that would require public disclosure. "This is highly irregular," Marcus Webb protested. "It's perfectly legal," Patterson replied. "The shareholders have lost confidence in Ms. Caro's ability to manage this company effectively. They want new leadership." What followed was 30 minutes of legal posturing and corporate theater. The board members scrambled to understand who these mysterious investors were and what they wanted. Willa tried to defend her record while privately calculating her chances of survival. Patterson left them with copies of the legal filing and a promise that the vote would proceed on schedule. After the lawyers departed, the boardroom erupted in heated discussion. "Who are these people?" Willa demanded. "Never heard of any of them," Webb admitted. "But if they control 28% of the voting shares, they have significant influence." What none of them realized was that the mysterious shareholders had a very specific agenda. They didn't want to run McVeigh Precision Works, they wanted to restore it to its former glory under leadership that understood the value of skilled workers and quality craftsmanship. 30 days later, the vote was held in the same boardroom where Ronan had been terminated. This time, he was there in person, introduced as a consultant representing the investment coalition. He wore his best suit, a modest outfit that looked shabby compared to the designer clothes around the table, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who held all the cards. The vote was swift and decisive. Willa Caro was removed as CEO by a margin of 68%. The board members who had supported her purge of experienced workers were replaced by people who understood manufacturing from the ground up. Deshaun Briggs was reinstated as lead engineer with a substantial raise and a mandate to rebuild the apprentice program. Maribel Franco was brought in as head of innovation, tasked with integrating human expertise with technological advancement. Ronan never spoke during the meeting. He simply sat in the back row and watched justice being served one vote at a time. When it was over, he walked through the factory floor where he'd spent most of his adult life. The workers he'd trained were back at their stations, their jobs secure for the first time in months. Young Jake Morrison approached him near the CNC machines. "Mr. Merritt, I wanted to thank you for what you did." "I didn't do anything, son." The shareholders made their decision based on what was best for the company. Jake grinned. "Sure. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that all the good workers are getting their jobs back, and the people who know what they're doing are running things again." Ronan clapped the young man on the shoulder. "Sometimes the market corrects itself. Now get back to work. You got a lot to learn." As he walked toward the exit, Ronan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. He had resources now and connections and a network of people who shared his vision of what American manufacturing could be. Willicaro downfall was just the first victory in a much larger war. The Pittsburgh Technology Summit was held every spring at the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, attracting entrepreneurs, investors, and innovators from across the region. This year's theme was the future of supply chain management, a topic that should have been perfect for Calder's comeback presentation. Ronan arrived early and found a seat in the back of the main auditorium. The crowd was typical for these events. Young faces mixed with gray-haired venture capitalists, everyone dressed in the uniform of the new economy. Dark jeans, expensive sneakers, and shirts that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Calder was scheduled to speak at 2 o'clock, pitching his latest product development to an audience that included potential investors and strategic partners. According to the conference program, he was presenting Logi Flow 3.0, revolutionizing industrial efficiency through predictive analytics. It sounded impressive, but Ronan knew the reality behind the marketing language. Calder's company was hemorrhaging money. His staff was down to 3 employees, and his last 2 product launches had failed to gain market traction. This presentation was a desperate attempt to attract the funding he needed to avoid bankruptcy. The T-145. Ronan watched his son pace backstage, reviewing his notes and adjusting his tie with nervous energy. Calder had lost weight over the past year, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. The conference moderator introduced Calder with enthusiasm that felt slightly forced. The applause was polite but scattered. In the tech world, nothing killed enthusiasm faster than the smell of desperation. Calder's presentation was technically competent but uninspiring. He clicked through slides showing market analysis, competitive advantages, and revenue projections that everyone in the audience knew were overly optimistic. His voice was steady, but Ronan could see the tension in his son's shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he gestured toward the screen. Logi Flow 3.0 represents a quantum leap forward in supply chain optimization, Calder was saying. Our proprietary algorithms can predict bottlenecks before they occur, reducing inefficiency by up to 37%. The audience listened politely, but Ronan could sense their skepticism. These people had heard dozens of similar pitches, and they knew the difference between genuine innovation and desperate marketing. Then Calder dropped what he thought was his closing bomb. "I'm pleased to announce that we're in final negotiations with Westinghouse for a comprehensive implementation of our platform across their entire southeastern manufacturing network. This partnership will validate our technology and provide the revenue stream necessary for rapid scaling." A murmur went through the audience. Westinghouse was exactly the kind of blue-chip client that could legitimize a struggling startup. If the deal was real, it would be a game-changer for Calder's company. Unfortunately for Calder, the deal wasn't real anymore. The conference moderator returned to the stage and thanked Calder for his presentation. Then he made an announcement that Ronan had been waiting months to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special addition to today's program. I'd like to introduce Maribel Franco, CEO of VectorPath Solutions, who will be presenting their revolutionary approach to industrial automation. Calder's face went white. VectorPath was the competitor that had been systematically undermining his business for months, always seeming to appear wherever he was trying to win contracts. Now they were here, at his moment of triumph, ready to steal his thunder. Maribel took the stage with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. She was dressed professionally, but not flashily, and her presentation materials were crisp and well-prepared. "Thank you for allowing me to share VectorPath's vision," she began. "We believe that the future of manufacturing lies not in replacing human expertise, but in amplifying it through intelligent technology." Her presentation was everything Calder's wasn't. Clear, compelling, and backed by real-world results from actual implementations. She showed case studies of factories where productivity had increased while maintaining quality and worker satisfaction. She demonstrated technology that enhanced human capabilities rather than replacing them. And then she delivered the knockout punch. I'm excited to announce that VectorPath has just signed a comprehensive partnership agreement with Westinghouse. This contract will allow us to implement our integrated automation platform across 12 manufacturing facilities over the next 18 months. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. The Westinghouse deal, the same contract Calder had claimed to be negotiating, had gone to his competitor. In front of an audience of potential investors and partners, his last hope for salvation had been publicly executed. Calder sat in the front row, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The business plan he'd been building for months had just collapsed in real time, broadcast to everyone who mattered in the Pittsburgh tech community. After Maribel's presentation ended, the moderator made one final announcement. "Before we conclude today's session, I'd like to introduce someone who has been instrumental in VectorPath's success. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ronan Merritt, strategic advisor and founding investor." Ronan stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. The audience applauded politely, not recognizing the name or understanding his significance. But in the front row, Calder's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, dawning horror. Ronan took the microphone and looked out at the audience. His son sat frozen in his chair, staring up at the father he'd dismissed as a broken-down relic. "Thank you," Ronan said simply. "I'm not much for speeches, but I wanted to say something about the importance of experience in this industry." He paused and let his eyes find Calder's face. "For 37 years, I worked in manufacturing. I learned that the best technology in the world is worthless without people who understand how to build things, fix things, and make them work properly. I also learned that success isn't just about having a good idea, it's about having the patience and resources to see that idea through to completion." Another pause. The audience was listening intently now, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what it was. Some people think that experience is obsolete, that wisdom can be replaced by algorithms, that the old ways of doing things have no place in the modern economy. They're wrong. Ronan handed the microphone back to the moderator and walked off the stage. As he passed Calder's row, he stopped and looked down at his son. "You always said I didn't plan for the future," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "You were right. That's why I started planning yours." The parking lot of the convention center was nearly empty by the time Calder caught up with his father. Ronan was unlocking his truck, the same reliable Ford he'd been driving for years, when he heard footsteps behind him. "Dad!" Ronan turned around slowly. His son looked older than his 34 years, the stress of the past year etched in the lines around his eyes and the gray threads in his hair. "Hello, Calder. We need to talk." "Do we?" Calder ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that reminded Ronan of the boy he used to be. "You destroyed me. My company, my marriage, everything I worked for. You destroyed it all." "I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your choices." "This isn't about consequences. This is about revenge." Ronan leaned against his truck and studied his son's face. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I regret what happened? I want you to explain why you did this to me." "You want an explanation?" Ronan's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. 8 months ago, I came to you for help. Not money, not charity, just a place to stay while I figured out what to do next. You looked at me like I was a beggar. Your wife lectured me about responsibility and planning. You told me you weren't running a retirement home for bitter old men. Calder's face flushed. I was under a lot of pressure. The business was struggling, because you didn't know how to run it. You had good ideas, but no patience. You understood technology, but not people. You knew how to pitch investors, but not how to deliver results. So you decided to prove that by sabotaging everything I work for. I decided to prove that experience matters, that relationships matter, that treating people with respect matters. Ronan pushed himself away from the truck and took a step closer to his son. You threw away 37 years of loyalty for the sake of appearing successful to a woman who married you for your money. Mallory didn't. Mallory left you the minute your financial situation got difficult. She filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, and she's already dating one of her father's business associates, a man with a more stable income. The words hit Calder like physical blows. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked like the frightened child he'd once been. You didn't have to destroy me to make your point. Yes, I did. Ronan's voice was implacable. You needed to understand what it feels like to lose everything because of other people's decisions. You needed to learn that your success was built on other people's work, other people's loyalty, other people's willingness to help you when you needed it. I get it, okay? I was wrong. I should have helped you. I should have been more grateful for everything you did for me. I'm sorry. Ronan studied his son's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or just another attempt at manipulation. What he saw was a broken man who'd finally run out of options and was trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Sorry doesn't undo 8 months of consequences. What do you want from me? What would it take for you to stop this? Nothing. The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Dad, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your son. My son died the day he chose pride over family. You're just someone who happens to share my last name. Calder's face crumpled. You can't mean that. I learned something important from you, Calder. I learned that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. I learned that success can make people forget where they came from. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the first ones to abandon you when times get hard. Ronan opened the door of his truck and climbed behind the wheel. Where does this leave us? Calder asked desperately. It leaves you exactly where you left me 8 months ago. Alone, with nothing, facing an uncertain future. Ronan started the engine. The difference is, I had the character to survive it. We'll see if you do. He drove away without looking back, leaving his son standing alone in the empty parking lot. In his rearview mirror, Ronan could see Calder's figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. 3 weeks later, Calder filed for bankruptcy. His house went into foreclosure, his remaining employees found other jobs, and his carefully cultivated reputation in the tech community was destroyed. He moved into a studio apartment in a part of town he'd never visited when he was successful, and took a job doing technical support for a software company that paid a fraction of what he'd once earned. Some people might have called it a tragic end to a promising career. Ronan called it justice. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Lawrenceville, a neighborhood that had once been industrial but was now home to artists and entrepreneurs. Ronan had bought the building 6 months earlier and spent weeks converting it into a training center for displaced workers who wanted to learn new skills. The space was filled with the familiar sounds of productive work, the whir of precision tools, the steady rhythm of metal being shaped, the quiet conversations of people focused on their tasks. 23 students were enrolled in the current session, ranging in age from 19 to 67. They were learning traditional machining, computer-controlled manufacturing, and basic robotics. Deshawn supervised the technical training, while Maribel taught the integration of old skills with new technology. Ronan moved between the workstations, offering guidance and encouragement to students who reminded him of his younger self. The program was free for anyone who qualified, funded through the Iron Valley Foundation, one of the charitable organizations Ronan had established to distribute his growing wealth. The students didn't know their benefactor's identity, and they didn't need to. What mattered was the opportunity to rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Mr. Merritt, a young woman, approached him with a completed project, a precision housing for a medical device that required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. How's this look? Ronan examined the piece carefully, running his fingers over the smooth surfaces and checking the critical dimensions with a micrometer. The work was excellent, better than what most people could produce after months of training. Outstanding, Maria. You've got real talent for this. She beamed with pride. Think I'm ready for the advanced program? I think you're ready for whatever you want to do. Maria had been laid off from a textile factory that moved its operations to Mexico. 6 months ago, she'd been facing eviction and considering leaving Pittsburgh to find work. Now she was being recruited by 3 different manufacturing companies that needed skilled workers. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Bertie LaCroix walked in carrying 2 bags of food from her diner. She'd started providing lunch for the students after discovering that some of them couldn't afford to eat regularly. Feeding time, she announced. Got your usual order, plus some extra pierogies for the skinny kid over there. She set the bags on a workbench and pulled Ronan aside. You see the news about your boy? Ronan had been avoiding news about Calder, but Bertie kept him informed whether he wanted to hear it or not. He got a job, software support, $28,000 a year, no benefits. Works in a cubicle in some office park in Cranberry. Ronan felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no desire to help or to hurt. His son had become irrelevant to his life, a stranger whose fate didn't affect him one way or another. Good for him. Bertie studied his face. You ever gonna stop holding grudges? Nope, just gonna keep winning them. She laughed and started unpacking the food. The students gathered around the impromptu lunch counter, their conversation mixing technical discussions with personal stories and gentle jokes. It was the kind of community that Ronan had tried to build at McVeigh Precision, the kind of place where people looked out for each other and took pride in their work. After lunch, Ronan returned to his small office at the back of the workshop. The walls were covered with photographs of successful graduates, letters from employers praising the program, and blueprints for expansion into other cities. His desk was cluttered with proposals for new initiatives and reports on existing programs. The Iron Valley Foundation now operated training centers in Erie, Youngstown, and Akron. They provided job placement services, small business loans, and scholarship programs for workers who wanted to pursue additional education. The foundation's assets had grown to over $8 million, generating enough income to sustain operations indefinitely. Ronan had kept Dorothy's promise to make the money count. He'd built something that would outlast him, something that would help people long after he was gone. His phone rang. Patricia Morrison, calling with the quarterly financial report. The investment portfolio is up 12% this year, she said. At this rate, you'll have more money than you can spend in 3 lifetimes. Then we'll start more programs. Ronan, you've already done more good with this inheritance than most people do with their entire lives. Don't you think it's time to enjoy some of it yourself? Ronan looked through his office window at the workshop floor, where people who'd been written off by the economy were building new careers with their hands and their minds. Maria was teaching an older student how to operate the CNC machine, passing on knowledge the way it had been passed to her. I'm enjoying it. After ending the call, Ronan walked back onto the workshop floor. The afternoon shift was winding down, and students were cleaning their work areas and preparing to leave. Some would go home to families who were proud of their progress. Others would go to part-time jobs that helped pay the bills while they learned new skills. All of them would return tomorrow, ready to build something with their hands and their hearts. Deshawn approached with a clipboard full of paperwork. Got 3 companies asking about graduates for next month. Looks like we're going to have a 100% job placement rate again. Good problem to have. You know what the best part is? These kids aren't just getting jobs. They're getting careers. Real skills they can build on for the rest of their working lives. Ronan nodded. That had been the point from the beginning, not to create more widget makers, but to give people the tools they needed to adapt and thrive in a changing economy. As the students filed out for the day, calling goodbyes and making plans for evening study sessions, Ronan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He'd started this journey as a victim, a man whose life had been upended by forces beyond his control. He was ending it as a builder, someone who created opportunities instead of just taking them. The front door opened one last time, and Maribel entered with a stack of contracts from potential corporate partners. VectorPath just signed deals with 4 more manufacturers, she said. We're going to need to hire 12 more engineers by the end of the year. Find the right people. Experience matters more than credentials. Already on it, Deshawn's putting together a list of candidates. Ronan locked up the workshop and walked to his truck. The Lawrenceville neighborhood was bustling with evening activity, young professionals heading to trendy restaurants, artists opening their studios for first Friday gallery walks, families pushing strollers toward the park along the river. IT was a different world from the one he'd grown up in, when this area was filled with steel mills and blue-collar families. But the fundamental human need to build something meaningful hadn't changed. The tools were different, the products were different, but the satisfaction of creating something useful with your hands and mind remained the same. Driving home through the streets of Pittsburgh, Ronan reflected on the lessons he'd learned over the past year. His son had taught him that family loyalty couldn't be taken for granted. The corporate executives had taught him that success was fragile and easily lost. His Aunt Dorothy had taught him that true wealth came from having choices, not from accumulating possessions. But the most important lesson had come from the students in his workshop. They taught him that redemption was possible, that people could reinvent themselves if given the opportunity and support they needed. Ronan Merritt had lost a job, a family, and an identity. In return, he'd gained perspective, purpose, and the resources to make a real difference in other people's lives. IT seemed like a fair trade.